time for us to check back in with the thread that runs so true. If you missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Mr. Easton worked fast. The very next day, he stopped and told me he had everything fixed for me to date May Woods. He said, "You know, I told her last night about you. I went over to Oscar Penix's place, where she boards, and I told her you'd straighten that school out down where there's run off every school teacher. And I told her about what you did for me. I told her you even figured out how many bushels of coal on my wagon bed." Oh, she was excited about it, he continued. "I was very frank with her. I put the cards on the table. I told her that she needed to go with a man like you, and you needed a woman like her. I'm not a matchmaker, but I think you'd make the best married pair that ever lived in these parts. We'd be glad to have a couple like you to live right here in Lonesome Valley and spend your days with us. Now, I've made the date with her for you to go see her at Oscar Penix's place tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. It's not more than 2 miles up there, and you won't have any trouble finding the house. It's the first house on your right after you pass the schoolhouse." "I'll be there," I said. There was nothing left for me to say. I hadn't told him to make the date. I had never had a blind date before. I had not had many dates in my life. I knew I must keep up my end of the bargain. This was a long shot in the dark. I didn't know May Woods, but if she's a school teacher, I thought, and is as beautiful as he says she is, she must be all right. At about 7 that evening, I was on my way to Upper Lonesome. I had waited for the dew to settle the dust before I started, because I wore white shoes and I didn't want to get them brown with dust, and I didn't want to get any dust on my white suit. I wanted to show May Woods that I was everything Bert Eastman had told her I was and more. I wanted to give her a surprise. This was a blind date and a shot in the dark for both of us, but I knew as I walked along that blind dates had developed into serious love affairs and often marriage. These thoughts raced through my mind as I walked swiftly along the brown winding road, always careful not to step too hard to stir the dust beneath the thin gossamer of dew dampness. I passed the Faith Healing Holiness Church. Little crowds of men, women, and children had already begun to gather. The men carried unlit lanterns and the women carried babies. They would need their lanterns, for they would stay until the moon was down. Just a few steps beyond, on the opposite side of the road, was the Free Will Baptist Church, which John Conway attended, and I met the Free Will Baptists on their way to church. The men carried unlit lanterns, and the women carried babies. I had learned from my sister and from the people of Lonesome Valley that on the same night a meeting was held at one church, a meeting was held at the other. These churches were great rivals. In Lonesome Valley, there was no other churches, no people of any other religious faith. If there were any, I had never heard tell of them. And according to the conversations of these religious people, there were 2 heavens. If not 2 heavens, heaven was certainly divided. There was a Faith Healing Holiness heaven and a Free Will Baptist heaven. The 2 churches fought it out like 2 rival stores across the street from each other, selling the same kind of merchandise, manufactured by the same company, yet each merchant giving a slightly different sales talk to the people ready to buy. This religious feeling divided the people more than politics. Lonesome Valley, in reality, was one little world to itself, but in thought of the hereafter, it was 2 separate worlds. One had to believe in one of these worlds. One was high pressure to take sides. I had steered clear of both, though I was accused of leaning toward the Free Will Baptists because I lived with John Conway, one of their hard-working members. I chuckled to myself after I passed the crowds and couples going to the Free Will Baptist Church about what John Conway said to me after he had gone to see Nancy Cochran. "She is one of them sanctifiers," he said, but I told her plainly we didn't want Lonesome Valley School disturbed by her guitar playing and singing during book hours. First time I'd ever been in her store, and she was scared to death of me when I walked in. I was scared to death of her, too. The jolt wagon wheel of yellow moon was rolling not too high above the green hills under heaven. It was soft and mellow, with the man still in it, put there for burning brush on Sunday, for I could see his shape as it had been shown to me when I was a child. He was still there for his evil deed. This devil moon, even if he did hold as prisoner this poor man, was soft and bright and beautiful, and his mellow shafts of light flooded Lonesome Valley with tainted moonlight gold. This was the kind of night to have a date. It was the kind of night to be young and dressed in white, and to be hatless with crow-wing black hair slicked back over the head. This was the kind of night for a young man to go see a beautiful girl. He felt love in his heart and brain and in the air he breathed. It was the time to go see a beautiful girl he had never seen before. The whippoorwills, nightingales, and insects were inspired to sing. I couldn't blame them for singing. I sang too. Something deep within stirred me to song, and the distance seemed shorter. The road crossed Lonesome Creek, and when I leaped the stream to keep from soiling my white shoes, I leaped a golden stream. The moonlight had changed it to the color of the moon. What a night! What a beautiful journey! What a sentimental one, too, for I was beginning to have more dreams of May Woods, what she looked like, wondering if she were as beautiful as Bert Eastman had said. Besides falling in love with her, for I was in the mood on a night like this to fall in love, I thought we might add a little business to our first meeting. We might match our schools to spell against each other, and to work arithmetic against each other, and to have rival ball games and even a picnic some Friday afternoon, and let our pupils play the needle's eye together. It would be great fun for her and me, like a father and mother, to watch over our combined large family. Such thoughts raced through my mind as I came into shadows that cut away the moonlight. Lonesome Creek and the Lonesome Creek Road parted here like two lovers. Lonesome Creek went into the dark forest, heavy with aromatic leaf and blossom. At this point, the forest closed in on both sides of the road. I followed, feeling my way with my feet, a road that was as dark and strange as time. I looked to my left and to my right for an opening of light, of golden moonlight upon the open fields, upon the patches of ripening wheat and oats, broad-leafed, lusty green growing tobacco, and the dark clouds of stalwart corn. I was thinking just a few yards beyond I would reach the light, and then I would be there, when a barrage of something come through the trees like a flushed covey of birds flying for their lives. One of the objects caught me square on the jaw, and the juice spattered my lips. I knew by the taste and the smell it was a rotten tomato. I stopped in the road. I couldn't think fast enough. My white suit was the same kind of target to them as a white chicken roosting in a winter leafless tree at night is to a hoot owl. They could see me, but I couldn't see them, and how many there were throwing at me I could only guess by the way the tomatoes, rotten eggs, I knew by their smell, good eggs, apples, squashes, pumpkins, and melons were hurled at me in an avalanche like hailstones. They couldn't miss because too many missiles were thrown from too many angles toward one white target. A rotten egg yellowed my hair. A good egg caught me on the same spot the rotten tomato had hit. A squash, melon, or pumpkin caught me on the leg above the knee and broke into fragments. I put my hands over my eyes to protect them and ran forward thinking I could brave the avalanche. I couldn't push through it. Then I heard laughter and screams back in the darkness under the trees. There must have been 50 boys and men. They made more noise than all my pupils would have made at Lonesome Valley if they had screamed at the top of their voices at the same time. In the middle of the road, I did an about-face in a hurry and started back, for I was covered from head to foot with oozy and dripping stuff that didn't smell good or taste good. I was hit on the mouth several times. Now I was laying my feet down on the dusty road like a running horse. The missiles kept coming, and the wild crowd, laughing and giving war whoops, came from the dark shadows in hot pursuit. Pistols were fired and bullets went through the leaves high over my head. I could hear them spatting the leaves and hitting the branches and bodies of trees and singing off into space. When I came back into the light, Lonesome Creek, that had been golden when I crossed it going up, was lead-colored to me. I sailed over it like a bird. Dust on my shoes meant nothing to me now, for I was running as I had never run before with the pack on my trail. And the eggs and tomatoes were flying, for they were light and good for long-range throwing. I was afraid to look back. I was trying to outdistance this pack of screaming fury. Just before I reached the Free Will Baptist Church, a rotten egg thrown by some strong arm over a spur of hill where the road made a bend came down like an artillery shell on its exact spot. It exploded on top of my head. I thought once of running inside the church, but something urged me on. I pushed my tired body with every ounce of energy I had. I knew if they followed me much farther, I would dive into the second church, but they didn't. I heard their wild screams and roars of laughter on the wind that moved slowly down the valley. When I passed the Faith Hill and Holiness Church, I was barely walking. I was wet with egg goo mixed with rotten tomato, melon, squash, pumpkin, and sweat. My white suit was so wet it stuck to my body and encased it like long underwear. The front door of the church was wide open on this hot night, and the house was packed with people. They were all using all sorts of fans, from cardboard backs of tablets to short, leafy poplar limbs. I saw Nancy Cochran standing up front, playing her guitar and singing a special number, I'm Naturalized for Heaven. Amens were going up from all parts of the room. I didn't linger long before the church. I moved down the road that was not as beautiful as it had been. When I reached Conway's, I couldn't go inside with the clothes I was wearing, white clothes which I'd never wear again at night in Lonesome Valley. I found a bar of soap in the soap box on the back porch. I found a hole of water in Lonesome Creek surrounded by willows. There was only one place where the moon's ray could come through. I pulled off my clothes and shoes. Even my underwear and socks were soaked with rotten eggs. I soaped and washed my body from head to toe. I washed my clothes and spread them on the brush for tomorrow's sun. Then I hurried to the house to beat Conway's home from church. The news of my going to see the Upper Lonesome teacher, May Woods, spread like wildfire up and down the entire length and breadth of Lonesome Valley. Everybody was laughing. When I ate my breakfast the next morning, everybody at Conway's breakfast table wanted to laugh. Even Silent Flossie thought it was funny. When she looked at me, she smiled as she had never smiled before. John Conway would break out laughing, and then he would tell a joke. He tried to make me think he was laughing at something else, but I knew he wasn't. Bertha Conway smiled as she poured my coffee. Dawn would look across the table at me and grin like a possum. Everybody wanted to laugh, and they puffed like frogs trying to hold their laughter. But not one mentioned what had happened to me, and I didn't mention it either. When I went to school, my pupils smiled, all but one. Guy Hawkins didn't smile. They wanted to laugh too because they had heard Bert Eastman make the date for me. They whispered and smiled at one another. Often one would be looking directly at me when he whispered, but not one mentioned the affair where I could hear him. They laughed on the playground more than they had ever laughed. Something funny was in the wind. Something funny had been broadcast on the wind. Our noon hour was over, and we were back in the schoolroom when Bert Eastman drove his mule team under the sycamore shade and stopped. He jumped off the wagon and ran stiff-legged toward the schoolhouse. I met him at the door, and we walked out to the coal wagon together. We got away from my pupils' hearing. I'm sorry about what happened last night, he apologized. It looks like I'm the goat of all that happened. Plenty happened, all right, I said, and I'm the goat. Let me tell you what happened, he explained. That's why I'm late with my coal today. I never heard about it until this morning. This fella Bill Coffey, Miss Woods has been a sparkin', rounded back unexpectedly from the Auckland rolling mills. He found out she had a date with you, and he went wild when she wouldn't break the date with you for him. He said he'd break it in a nice way. He broke it all right, I said, but not in a nice way. You didn't tell me she dated anybody else. Yep, she's sparked Bill for a couple of years now, Bert spoke softly. But I thought you had a good chance of beating his time. He went around there among the upper Lonesome boys, and you know they don't have much use for the lower Lonesome boys, let alone a stranger, and they got ready for you. See, Bill Coffey is an upper Lonesome boy himself, and he knows just about everybody up there. Bill can have me, as far as I'm concerned, I said. I've never seen her or him, and I don't care to see them. I'm sorry it all happened the way it did, he said. Did they hurt you? Not exactly, I said. Did they run you a fur piece? Just to the Faith, Hill, and Holiness Church, I said. 'Pon my word, he said, ain't it awful? He got on his coal wagon, and I went back into the schoolhouse. Right then I learned for the first time a joke at the other fellow's expense was funny to everybody. Man is often reminded of his past actions in the most conspicuous surroundings. I had just returned from school that day and had sat down on the porch where the Conway family was sitting, fanning themselves with long fronds of a creek willow, shooing the flies and stirring the stuffy air when it happened. I looked down across the yard at the Lonesome Creek Road, and I saw an automobile coming down the road, larger than any car I'd ever seen in Lansboro. It was a green convertible, and the top was down. The young man behind the steering wheel was wearing a striped silk shirt and a high collar and a flashy tie. He had a long cigar in his mouth, and a thin stream of smoke trailed behind the car and thinned to nothingness on the wind. He was driving the car with one hand, and he had his right arm around a beautiful girl. She looked, from where I sat on the porch, like a beautiful girl. Her black hair was blown back by the wind. Who in the world is that? I asked, wondering if this long automobile would manage the narrow turns in the Lonesome Valley Road. Then everybody on Conway's porch started laughing. The pent-up laughter that they had been wanting to turn loose burst forth like water from a swimming hole when the mud dam gives way to pressure. They laughed until they couldn't answer my question. The car turned the bend and was out of sight. "That's Bill Coffey and May Woods," Dawn finally said between spasms of laughter. I felt a warm glow spread over my face. "He must own the Auckland steel mills," I said. "No, he just works there," Dawn replied. "He's a welder." "You know, Bill Coffey has done better than anybody ever expected him to do," John admitted after he was through laughing. "People around here never thought old Bill would amount to a hill of beans. He never would go to school, got to the first reader. Then he quit and tried to farm. He couldn't do that. Then he went to the Auckland steel mills, and he made good. Makes over $300 a month, so I've heard." "He's not been at the Auckland mills but a couple of years," Dawn continued. "First year he worked there, he came back here with a new car, and he was wearing $10 shirts and $15 shoes. Every girl on Lonesome was a-trying to go with him, but May Woods beat all their times. She makes him awful jealous by having a date with somebody else now and then." "May Woods holds a first-class certificate too," John bragged. What a fool I've been, I thought. Never again will I accept a blind date. Never will I take another shot in the dark. I knew this event would be news history for the people in Lonesome Valley. I would never be able to live it down. Friday at noon of my third week, I dismissed the school to go home. I had to fetch much-needed supplies for my school from Lansboro. So many things needed to be done, and to get to Lansboro, I had to walk 5 miles to the valley and catch the afternoon Old Line Special. I'd heard many teachers say that school teaching was dull and uninteresting. It was the most interesting thing I had ever done, and these 3 weeks had seemed like 3 days. I was trying to impart my scant knowledge to youth with even lesser knowledge, but I had learned more from my pupils and from the patrons of my district in Upper Lonesome than I had ever learned in 3 weeks before. It took me 1 hour to walk through the sweltering August heat and clouds of dust to the valley. There I caught the old line special, and as I rode towards Lansboro, the thoughts I had about teaching while riding this train 3 weeks before came back to me. The little fears I had no longer troubled me. There were other things other than discipline that worried me. When the train reached Lansboro, I hurried home. Next morning, bright and early, I went to see John Hampton. I went to find out if his old car still climbed hills in reverse instead of low, but he had had it overhauled, and he promised to take me back to Lonesome Valley on Sunday. Since he had to get supplies for his school, we went together to Lansboro in his car. Then we went to Mr. Steiger's office. "Well, how are you getting along, Mr. Stuart?" my superintendent asked me. "All right, sir," I said. "Have you heard any reports?" "No, I haven't," he said. "Not yet. But you haven't," he almost whispered, "come in to give the school up, have you?" "Oh, no," I said. "I've come for supplies." "What do you want in the way of supplies?" he asked, for he was pleased that I was staying with Lonesome Valley. "Coal bucket, erasers, chalk, window panes?" "All of that and more too," I said, as John Hampton looked strangely at me. "I want 2 bags of lime, a water cooler with a faucet, enough paint to paint my schoolhouse, paint brushes, hatchet, hammer, nails, hoe, rake, axe, and shovel." "Just a minute," Mr. Steigers broke in. "Who's going to paint the house?" "I'm going to paint it," I said. "I'm going to clean that place up." "What are you going to do with the lime?" he asked. "First call I've ever had for lime." "Use it as an antiseptic in the vaults of the outdoor privies," I said. "Flies won't mess around lime." After we had discussed the use of each item, he agreed to let me have all the supplies, although I was getting far beyond my allowance because I agreed to paint the house free of cost. Mr. Steigers wrote an order for my supplies at the Lawson Hardware. Sunday at noon, John Hampton and I started for Lonesome Valley. As he drove along, he told me of his many experiences teaching. He said I might think that I would turn the world over to see what was on the underside while I was young and a beginning teacher, but later I would slow down and be well contented to accept what was on top of the world. I let him talk, for I was riding in his car, and he had been a friend to me to help me get this school. I let him do the talking, and I listened. By 6 o'clock, we were at Conway's. We had made approximately 7.5 miles an hour, and I heard the death bells ringing in my ears after all the clatter his car engine had made climbing the steep hills. John Hampton went back to Lansboro, and as soon as I had eaten supper, Don Conway helped me carry the lime over to the schoolhouse. We took a sack to the boys' privy, and when we went inside, I got a surprise. 2 days before, Friday, when I had dismissed school, there was not a mark on the walls. Now they were marked all over, and I was depicted in all the vulgar caricatures. There were all sorts of these. May Wood's name was written beside my name, and there were the same vulgar caricatures of her. And Don's sister Flossie's name was printed all over the walls and up overhead beside mine. She was also portrayed in obscene pictures. "Who on earth did a thing like this?" I asked Don. "Suppose one of the pupils?" "I don't think so," he said. "I think it's somebody that doesn't go to school." I immediately thought, since we had dismissed at noon on Friday, that some of my pupils might have slipped back to the schoolhouse. Don and I sprinkled lime down in the vault and left the remainder of the bag inside for future use. Then we went to the girls' side, and there was not a mark. We used our lime here and then went back to Conway's, where we got a bucket of water, soap, and broom, and returned and cleaned the walls of their obscene pictures. And we'll stop right there for today. Although I wanted to go back and read. I like his friend there that took him back. You could tell he didn't like what he was saying, but he said, I might think that I would turn the world over to see what was on the underside while I was young and a beginning teacher, but later I would slow down and be well contented to accept what was on top of the world. I hope I don't never get too old to want to turn the world over, and in situations like that and really look at it in every direction and be energetic about what's going on. I hope I stay like that. And I think Jesse Stuart stayed like that his whole life. Anyway, that was an interesting way to phrase that. So, really exciting part of the book. My goodness. Don't you wish you could have been there to see some of this stuff? In the very beginning, when he's on his way to the date with Mae Woods that never actually happens, I really love all through this one. You can really see or see it if you're reading, but hear Jesse's beautiful way with words, the way he describes stuff. So in that first little part, I love the way he was kind of, laughing a little bit about the two churches competing with each other, and that both of them, they were the same going to church. The men were carrying their unlit lanterns because they knew they'd have to go back home in the dark, and then the women was carrying the babies. I'd love to have seen that. Last year, I guess it was last summer, me and Katie got to go to a church in Cutcane. I'm terrible, I can't remember the name of the church. Maybe it was Cutcane. It's an old church, but every year they have a revival, and they have it with lamplight. They do it like the old days. Some nights they even meet down the road and ride horses to there, and people dress like in, old-timey dresses. But it was really neat. They didn't do the horses the night that we went, but it was the whole service was they had lamps on the wall, and that was the only light. So that was really, really neat. Made me think of that. Now, him being set up on his blind date, he's so excited because he says, sometimes, which didn't turn out in this case, but sometimes blind dates, work out and you end up getting married. And he's just thinking, could this Mae Woods end up being my wife? And, how wonderful that'd be. She's a school teacher and I'm a school teacher and all that. But then obviously it didn't work like that for him. But me and Matt were set up on a blind date, so we're a good example of it actually working out. My cousin set us up on a date, and here we are all these years later. So it definitely did work for us. I really loved how he described the moon and the creek and all that. You could just feel like you were there on that night and hearing the sounds. And he said even the whippoorwills and the nightingales, the insects were singing, and then he started singing because he was just so happy. There he was all dressed up and hoping that he was going to go meet this beautiful girl and they were going to hit it off. And then since she was a teacher, he's even dreaming that maybe their kids, their students could get together and have spelling bees and go on picnics. And he just was dreaming all this in his mind, and being really particular with his white suit and his white shoes. And then suddenly he starts getting hit with the rotten tomatoes and the eggs. Oh my goodness. He just don't even know what to say about it. And you can just imagine, I can imagine the people throwing them too, how they were all in there. And there at the end, after all that happened, he found out, she had a boyfriend. Mr. Eastman just didn't tell him. But you can see all of them kind of huddled up saying, we're not going to let him do this. Some stranger come in here and try to take over, and I'm sure that they really enjoyed doing all the throwing. I thought it was interesting how he knew what all the things were by the way they smelled. He could tell. He was a farm boy. He grew up farming with his family, so he certainly knew all those smells. Rotten eggs smell terrible, but a rotten tomato smells pretty bad. Sometimes in the summer when we're growing tomatoes and one will get, maybe I don't see it because it's hid underneath somewhere, and then it busts open and it rots like under the plant, maybe it's up in there, up and under, as Matt would say, and I can't see it. It smells terrible. And of course when I find it, I always take it and throw it off the bank, and then I have to scrub my hands because that smell lingers on my hands. I love the part too, again, about his description, but I love this part because I've heard this, but it's been a long time ago. But the man in the moon, and he told the little thing how he'd been told as a child that the man that you can see like the shape of a man, that he was put there because he burnt brush on Sunday. Of course, on Sunday, if you were a religious person, you weren't supposed to be doing any work, especially, I guess, burning brush. But I thought that was very Appalachian, and I liked that. If you've heard that before, please leave a comment and share that. When my older brother Steve was little, before I come along, there's 5 years between us, Daddy and Mama or Granny and Pap, they would say that, like Steve, maybe they'd come home after church like that, and the moon was big in the sky, and he seen it, and he would cry. He'd say, "Daddy, get me that rock. Daddy, I want that rock. Get me that rock, Daddy." So I always think about that when I think about a big moon like that, like Jesse was seeing the man in the moon. Interesting too, on the way he's so happy, and he's just, the creek's golden, and it's just all the wonder of the beautiful night, and what a beautiful night, it's beautiful for love, and he's just really waxing poetic about all of it. But then once they start throwing that stuff at him, and he has to take off running, on his way back, none of it's like that. I like that. It was, the creek was golden, and then it was lead colored, and then as he run, all the beautiful things he had seen, it was just like they were gone, like they had never happened. I guess the magic spell or whatever, it's kind of like that. The spell of love he was under was broken. And really interesting, in those days, we've already seen this in the previous one where he got in the fight there at school. Interesting that there was no cell phones, of course. There was not even no telephones, there was nothing. But somehow people knew. So like by the time the Conways come back from church that night, and he was probably already gone to bed after he took his bath in the creek and washed his clothes, they knew what had happened. In the same way about the school fight, it's like news traveled very fast. And then the next day at school, when all the kids were trying not to laugh at him, they knew somehow. They all knew. That's really interesting to think about. Today we are so connected with our cell phones, and feel like you can't go somewhere over the weekend. I heard someone saying, used to you didn't even have them. Now you feel like you can't go anywhere without having them because somebody might need you, somebody in your family. But used to you went places and didn't have no way to contact each other, Anyway, but it was just interesting to think about that even in those days, pre all that communication, they still found a way to communicate and spread those, in this case, the funny story about Jesse. I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. Be sure to leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you, and I hope you'll drop back by next Friday. We'll have to see what happens to Jesse next.